Picture North Africa, November of 1942, the sun bleeding orange over the Atlas Mountains as German reconnaissance pilots filed their first reports on an aircraft they had never encountered before. The machine climbing toward them did not match anything in their intelligence briefings. Two engines mounted on twin booms, a central pod housing the pilot and armament, a silhouette so unusual that ground crews initially assumed the reports were exaggerated or mistaken. The Luftwaffe pilots who first tangled with it in the skies above Kasserine and Tunis walked away from those early encounters with a strange mixture of confusion and contempt. One veteran Messerschmitt pilot, a man with kills against the British already logged in his flight book, described the American aircraft to his squadron mates as clumsy, calling it a machine built by engineers who had never flown a fighter in their lives. He was not entirely wrong to be skeptical. The P-38 in its early combat deployment suffered real problems, compressibility issues and high-speed dives that could rip control away from a pilot at the worst possible moment, engines that sometimes failed in the thin cold air at altitude, cockpit heating so poor that pilots occasionally lost feeling in their hands during long missions over the Mediterranean. The Germans had reason to feel confident, and confidence bred the kind of arrogance that would come back to haunt them. What those early German pilots did not understand, what their intelligence services had failed to properly calculate, was that they were watching a weapons system still finding its voice. The P-38 Lightning had been born from a 1937 Army Air Corps requirement that sounded almost fantastical on paper, a fighter capable of reaching 360 miles per hour, climbing to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, and sustaining that performance for an hour. Lockheed's chief engineer, a young man named Kelly Johnson, who would later become legendary for designing the state Route 71 Blackbird, approached the problem with a solution nobody else had attempted. Instead of cramming everything into one engine and one fuselage, he split the aircraft into twin booms, each housing an Allison V1710 engine producing over 1,100 horsepower, with turbo-superchargers feeding them oxygen-rich air at altitudes where other fighters gasped for breath. Combined, those two engines delivered nearly 2,300 horsepower, more raw power than most bombers of the era carried, concentrated into a machine built for one purpose: hunting other aircraft out of the sky. The nose of the P-38 held something equally revolutionary for its time. Rather than the typical arrangement of wing-mounted guns that required careful convergence calculations, Johnson placed four 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon directly in the nose, all firing in a straight line without the need for convergence adjustments. This meant a P-38 pilot could hit a target accurately at ranges other fighters could only dream about, delivering a concentrated stream of destruction that did not spread and weaken with distance the way wing-mounted weapons did. German pilots who survived early encounters began reporting something troubling back to their commanders: that American fighters seemed capable of hitting targets from angles and distances that should not have produced accurate fire. What they were witnessing, without fully understanding it yet, was the mathematics of concentrated firepower finally being applied correctly to aerial combat. But mathematics alone does not win wars, and the P-38 needed pilots willing to trust an aircraft that Lockheed's own test program had revealed could kill you in ways no fighter pilot had experienced before. The early compressibility problems were real, and they were terrifying. Pilots diving at high speed toward enemy aircraft would sometimes find their control columns locked rigid, the aircraft refusing to respond as it entered a phenomenon called compressibility stall, where airflow over the wings at extreme speeds created shock waves that made the controls simply stop working. Several test pilots died before Lockheed engineers understood what was happening and developed dive flaps that could counteract the effect. This was not a minor footnote in the aircraft's history. It was a genuine crisis that nearly killed the program before it proved itself in combat. The men who flew early P-38 models into North African skies were essentially testing a weapon that was still being perfected in real time against an enemy that had years of combat experience and aircraft refined through the brutal efficiency of the Spanish Civil War and the early years of the European conflict. Yet something strange was happening in those North African skies, even as German confidence remained high. American pilots were returning from missions with kill claims that seemed impossible given the aircraft's supposed limitations. A 20-year-old lieutenant from the 1st Fighter Group, flying a P-38 against a formation of Messerschmitt 109s near Tunis, found himself boxed in by 3 enemy fighters in a maneuver that should have ended his short career permanently. Instead of trying to outturn his opponents, a fight the heavier American aircraft could not win against the more agile German fighter. He did something his instructors had drilled into him relentlessly. He used the raw power of those twin engines to simply outrun the engagement in a shallow dive, then used the concentrated nose armament to put a devastating burst into the wing root of the lead German fighter as it pursued him too aggressively. The Messerschmitt disintegrated in the air. His squadron mates who witnessed the engagement began calling it the Lightning trick, using speed and firepower rather than turning radius to win fights the aircraft was never designed to win through agility alone. German intelligence failed to notice one crucial detail as these reports began accumulating through late 1942 and early 1943. The fork-tailed devil nickname, born from mockery of the aircraft's unusual appearance, was starting to shift in meaning among the men who actually had to fly against it. Pilots who survived encounters with well-flown P-38s began describing something different to their commanders, no longer contempt but caution, a growing awareness that this strange twin-boom aircraft could reach speeds and altitudes that put German fighters at a disadvantage they had not experienced against American aircraft before. The nickname stayed the same, but the tone behind it was already beginning its long transformation from ridicule towards something considerably darker. By the summer of 1943, the character of the air war over the Mediterranean had shifted enough that German pilots stationed in Sicily and later Italy began approaching P-38 formations with markedly different tactics than they had used in North Africa. Gone was the casual confidence of late 1942. Luftwaffe squadron leaders started briefing their pilots specifically on how to handle the Lightning, warning them to avoid prolonged turning fights and instead attempt to use altitude advantages before the American fighters could climb to meet them. This represented a fundamental admission, whether spoken aloud or not, that the aircraft they had mocked as clumsy was now dictating the terms of engagement rather than simply reacting to German initiative. One Luftwaffe report from this period, later recovered and translated after the war, described American twin-engine fighters as possessing, quote, unusual endurance and firepower that requires revised tactical approaches, end quote. The bureaucratic language could not fully hide the underlying truth. The hunters had become increasingly cautious about their prey. The individual stories from this period reveal something the statistics alone cannot capture: the human courage required to fly an aircraft that demanded absolute precision under conditions where a single mistake meant death. Consider the story of a young captain from Minnesota, flying with the 82nd Fighter Group over the skies of Sardinia in mid-1943. He had already survived one engine failure at altitude, a terrifying experience that required him to nurse a crippled P-38 back to base on a single functioning Allison engine, an emergency procedure that many pilots and single-engine fighters simply did not have the option to attempt. Weeks later, leading a flight of 4 Lightnings on an escort mission, he encountered a much larger German formation attempting to intercept American bombers. Rather than retreating with the odds so heavily against his small flight, he used the aircraft's exceptional high-altitude performance to gain position above the German fighters, diving down through their formation with devastating effect before using his superior speed to extend away and set up for a second pass. His flight destroyed 4 enemy aircraft that day without losing a single P-38, a ratio that German pilots increasingly found themselves forced to accept rather than the guaranteed victories they had expected against American twin-engine fighters just months earlier. What happened next defied every assumption German high command had made about the limitations of twin-engine fighter design. Rather than remaining a niche aircraft suited only for bomber escort and reconnaissance, the P-38 began demonstrating versatility that surprised even American planners. It could carry bombs and rockets for ground attack missions, its twin engines providing redundancy that made it far more likely to survive battle damage than single-engine aircraft, a fact that became increasingly important as the war ground on and pilot losses represented an irreplaceable cost that no industrial capacity could fully offset. German ground forces began reporting a specific dread associated with the sound of P-38 engines approaching, a distinctive drone created by the twin Allisons that ground crews learned to recognize long before the aircraft came into visual range, giving them just enough warning to know that strafing runs or bombing attacks were likely imminent. The technical superiority driving these battlefield outcomes deserves closer examination, because understanding why the P-38 succeeded reveals something deeper about American industrial philosophy during the war. Those turbo-superchargers feeding the Allison engines were not simply bolted onto an existing design as an afterthought. They represented years of specialized engineering focused on solving the specific problem of maintaining engine performance at altitudes where thinner air normally strangled horsepower output. A standard engine operating at 25,000 feet might lose 40% of its sea-level power due to reduced air density, but the turbo-supercharger system on the P-38 compressed that thin high-altitude air before feeding it into the engine, allowing the aircraft to maintain near sea-level performance at altitudes where German fighters were already struggling. This meant American bomber formations receiving P-38 escort could count on protection that remained effective throughout the entire altitude range of a bombing mission, rather than fighters that faded in effectiveness as the bombers climbed toward their targets. The armament configuration told a similar story of deliberate engineering choices designed to maximize destructive efficiency. Those 450 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing approximately 800 rounds per minute, combined with a 20mm cannon carrying 60 rounds of high-explosive shells, created a weapons platform that could deliver devastating damage in extremely short engagement windows. A 2-second burst from a properly aimed P-38 could put over 150 caliber rounds combined with several cannon shells into a target, more concentrated firepower than most single-engine fighters of the era could match. German pilots who survived direct hits from this armament often described the experience in terms that revealed genuine shock. One former Luftwaffe pilot recounting after the war how a single burst from an American P-38 had torn his wing nearly in half, forcing an emergency bailout that left him with a permanent respect for what he called the flying cannon platform. Then it got worse for German pilots, hoping the P-38's early limitations would remain permanent handicaps. Lockheed engineers, working closely with combat pilots returning from the Mediterranean theater, continuously refined the aircraft throughout 1943, addressing the compressibility problems that had plagued early models through improved dive flaps and revised wing designs. Later production variants received more powerful engines, improved cockpit heating that finally solved the frostbite problems that had genuinely hampered pilot effectiveness in earlier models, and refined turbo-supercharger systems that reduced the mechanical failures that had occasionally embarrassed the aircraft during its combat debut. This represented something the German war machine, increasingly strained by resource shortages and the demands of a two-front war, found itself unable to match: the capacity to identify problems in an existing weapon system and rapidly iterate improvements while maintaining massive production output simultaneously. The psychological transformation among German pilots deserves its own careful examination, because the shift from mockery to genuine fear did not happen instantly. It accumulated through hundreds of individual encounters that gradually rewrote institutional memory within the Luftwaffe. By late 1943, as American forces pushed into Italy and P-38 squadrons operated with increasing frequency over targets that mattered strategically to German war planning, a noticeable shift appeared in how Luftwaffe pilots discussed the aircraft in their after-action reports and personal correspondence. The dismissive tone of 1942 had largely disappeared, replaced by tactical caution bordering on genuine respect. One squadron diary entry, recovered from a Luftwaffe unit stationed in northern Italy, described an encounter with American Lightnings in terms that would have seemed unthinkable a year earlier, noting that the American twin-engine fighters displayed, quote, aggressive tactics executed with skill that suggests thorough training and confidence in their equipment." End quote. Perhaps the ultimate vindication for the aircraft and the men who flew it came during the escort missions supporting the strategic bombing campaign against German industrial targets. Missions where the P-38's exceptional range became not just useful, but absolutely critical to American strategic goals. Early in the bombing campaign, American heavy bombers had suffered catastrophic losses on deep penetration raids into Germany, losses that occurred specifically because escort fighters lacked the range to accompany bombers all the way to distant targets and back. The P-38, with its combination of internal fuel capacity and the ability to carry external drop tanks, could escort bombers on missions that would have been suicide runs without fighter protection. German fighter pilots who had grown accustomed to attacking unescorted American bombers deep over German territory suddenly found themselves facing Lightning fighters appearing at ranges that should have been impossible given everything German intelligence had calculated about American fighter capabilities. This development terrified the Luftwaffe leadership in ways that went beyond individual combat losses, because it represented a strategic failure with cascading consequences. If American bombers could receive fighter protection deep into German airspace, the entire calculation of acceptable bomber losses that German air defense planning had relied upon collapsed. Luftwaffe fighter pilots, previously confident in their ability to punish American bomber formations once escort fighters reached the limits of their range and turned back toward friendly territory, now had to contend with P-38 squadrons appearing precisely at those critical moments when bombers were most vulnerable. One German fighter commander, writing after the war about this period, admitted that American escort fighter range had fundamentally altered German air defense strategy in ways that Luftwaffe planners had failed to adequately anticipate before the P-38 and later fighters like the Mustang demonstrated the true extent of American engineering capability. The individual courage displayed by American pilots flying these increasingly dangerous long-range missions cannot be overstated, and few stories capture this better than the experience of pilots flying with fighter groups that transitioned through the P-38 before later receiving different aircraft. Consider a young pilot who would later become one of the most celebrated American fighter aces of the entire war, cutting his combat teeth flying P-38 Lightnings with the 434th Fighter Squadron over occupied Europe in early 1944. This pilot, who would go on to legendary status flying different aircraft later in his career, learned the fundamental lessons of aerial combat while wrestling with the unique characteristics of the twin-boom fighter, the way it demanded pilots use energy management and positioning rather than pure turning ability to win engagements against more maneuverable German fighters. His early combat reports from this period described the frustration of adapting to an aircraft that punished pilots who tried to fight German fighters using their own preferred tactics, while rewarding those disciplined enough to exploit the P-38's genuine advantages in speed, firepower, and high-altitude performance. During one particularly harrowing mission escorting bombers toward targets deep in German territory, this same pilot found himself separated from his flight after a violent engagement with a superior number of German fighters. Alone, with his aircraft showing damage to one engine and his fuel reserves dwindling toward critical levels, he faced the kind of decision that separated survivors from casualties in this brutal air war. Rather than attempting a desperate dash for friendly territory that his damaged aircraft might not survive, he used his remaining altitude advantage and the surviving engine's turbo-supercharged performance to descend carefully while monitoring for pursuing the German fighters, eventually nursing his crippled Lightning back across the English Channel on a flight that should have been impossible given the damage his aircraft had sustained. This kind of resilience, built into the P-38's fundamental design through its twin-engine redundancy, saved countless pilots who would have died in single-engine fighters suffering similar battle damage, a fact that contributed enormously to pilot morale and confidence even during the aircraft's most challenging early deployment period. German intelligence failed to notice one crucial detail about this pattern of survivability that would prove increasingly costly as the war progressed. Every American pilot who survived a mission that would have killed him in a different aircraft represented experience that remained in the fighting force, training that did not need to be replaced, tactical knowledge that continued accumulating within American fighter squadrons even as German pilot losses mounted with devastating consistency throughout 1943 and in 1944. The war of attrition being fought in European skies was not simply about how many aircraft each side could produce. Though American industrial capacity certainly dwarfed anything Germany could match, it was equally about which side could preserve experienced pilots capable of training the next generation of fighter aviators. The P-38's engineering choices, criticized as unnecessary complexity by early German observers, were quietly preserving exactly the kind of veteran expertise that Germany found increasingly difficult to replace as its own experienced pilots died in aircraft offering no equivalent margin for survival. The numbers accumulating from this sustained campaign of engagement tell a story that individual anecdotes alone cannot fully capture, though every statistic represents real human courage and real human loss on both sides of these encounters. By the time American forces had pushed the air war deep into German territory during 1944, P-38 squadrons operating across multiple theaters had claimed thousands of aerial victories against German aircraft, a toll that grew heavier for the Luftwaffe with each passing month as American production continued outpacing anything German industry could match. Lockheed's factories, expanding their production capacity throughout the war years, would eventually build over 10,000 P-38 Lightnings before the conflict ended, a manufacturing achievement that meant American squadrons could sustain losses that would have crippled a smaller air force, while continuing to field overwhelming numbers of aircraft against increasingly stretched German defenses. This production reality carried devastating implications for German strategic planning that went beyond simple numerical comparisons. Every P-38 lost in combat could be replaced within weeks by American industrial capacity that operated with an efficiency German war planners had genuinely failed to anticipate before the conflict began. Meanwhile, German aircraft losses increasingly represented irreplaceable resources, both in terms of the aluminum and precious materials required for construction and, more critically, in terms of the experienced pilots whose deaths created gaps in squadron leadership that inexperienced replacements struggled to fill. A Luftwaffe fighter pilot lost in 1944 typically represented years of accumulated combat experience that simply could not be replicated by rushing new pilots through increasingly compressed training programs as German fuel shortages made extensive flight training increasingly impossible to sustain. What happened next in the Pacific Theater, where the P-38 also served with extraordinary distinction against Japanese forces, demonstrated the aircraft's versatility across radically different combat environments and enemy tactics. American pilots flying P-38s in the Pacific achieved the highest number of aerial victories of any American fighter type in that theater, a testament to the aircraft's exceptional range proving equally valuable against the vast distances of Pacific Island warfare as it had against the depth of German territory in Europe. This dual success across two completely different theaters of war, against two different enemy air forces with distinct tactical approaches, revealed something important about the fundamental soundness of Kelly Johnson's original engineering vision. The fork-tailed Devil had proven itself not just capable of countering specific German tactics in specific European conditions, but genuinely superior across the full range of combat environments American forces encountered throughout the entire war. The technical legacy of the P-38 extended well beyond its wartime combat record, influencing aircraft design philosophy in ways that shaped American aviation development for decades afterward. Kelly Johnson, the engineer who had solved the seemingly impossible design requirements of the original 1937 specification, carried forward the lessons learned from the P-38 program into his later work, developing some of the most advanced aircraft in American aviation history. The twin-engine reliability that had saved countless P-38 pilots during the war, the turbo-supercharger technology that had given the aircraft its exceptional high-altitude performance. These engineering principles echoed forward into subsequent generations of American military aircraft. informing design decisions that continued paying dividends long after the specific aircraft that pioneered these approaches had been retired from frontline service. German pilots and engineers who survived the war and later had opportunities to study captured or surrendered American aircraft in detail provided some of the most compelling testimony regarding the P-38's genuine engineering sophistication. Former Luftwaffe technical officers, examining P-38 airframes after the war's conclusion, expressed genuine admiration for design solutions that German aviation industry, despite its own considerable engineering talent, had never fully implemented in comparable German aircraft. One former German aviation engineer, interviewed years after the war about American fighter design, admitted that the P-38's combination of range, firepower, and structural resilience represented an engineering achievement that German industrial capacity during the war years, strained by resource shortages and Allied bombing campaigns targeting German manufacturing infrastructure, simply could not have matched even with equivalent design knowledge. The men who had first mocked the aircraft as flying oddity in the skies over North Africa, watching those unusual twin-boom silhouettes climb toward them with what seemed like clumsy determination, could not have imagined in late 1942 how thoroughly history would vindicate the American engineering choices they had initially dismissed. Their nickname, Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, born from contempt and confusion, would outlive the war itself as a term of genuine respect, a linguistic artifact preserving the memory of just how completely their assessment of American capability had been proven wrong. The devil in the name had indeed proven himself, not through supernatural menace, but through the far more devastating combination of superior engineering, industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Germany could match, and the courage of young American pilots willing to trust a complex and demanding aircraft through its difficult early development period until it matured into one of the most feared fighters of the entire war. Consider the full scope of what this aircraft ultimately achieved when measured against the skepticism that had greeted its combat debut. Over 10,000 P-38 Lightnings built across the war years, thousands of confirmed aerial victories claimed by American pilots flying this aircraft across two completely different theaters of war, and a psychological transformation among German pilots that took the aircraft from object of ridicule to subject of genuine tactical respect within less than 2 years of sustained combat operations. The statistics alone would justify calling the P-38 program a success, but the deeper truth lies in what those numbers represented for the broader war effort. Every German fighter pilot forced to alter his tactics specifically to counter P-38 capabilities represented degraded Luftwaffe effectiveness against other American and British aircraft operating in the same airspace. Every bomber crew that survived a deep penetration mission specifically because P-38 escort fighters extended protection beyond what German planners had anticipated represented lives saved and strategic bombing objectives achieved that would otherwise have come at devastating cost. The story returns, as it must, to that November morning in 1942 when confused German pilots first spotted this strange twin-tailed aircraft climbing through the Tunisian sky and struggled to categorize what they were seeing. That same aircraft, refined and matured through combat experience, engineering iteration, and the accumulated courage of thousands of American pilots, would eventually fly missions those early skeptical Germans could scarcely have imagined, escorting bombers across the full depth of German territory, sweeping Japanese aircraft from Pacific skies at ranges that dwarfed anything else in the American arsenal, and ultimately earning a grudging respect from the very enemy pilots who had first tried to laugh it out of the sky. They called it Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, meaning to mock its strange appearance and questionable early performance. History would remember that name for an entirely different reason, as recognition of a devil that had indeed earned its terrifying reputation through relentless engineering excellence and the unbreakable courage of the men who flew it into combat against overwhelming odds and emerged as legends of American airpower. The fork-tailed devil had proven every skeptic wrong, and in doing so, had helped secure a victory that changed the course of history itself.